to make it enticing for developers. And if you keep going down the list and keep going down the list, at about infinity minus 12, it said, oh, and we need to make it the best web framework for developers to actually build stuff. What you end up with are crazily inappropriate uses of technology. And this is a true story from within this last year. I was consulting with a company that had a problem. They had this, it was a portlet application running, of course, on WebSphere, the whole stack of IBM software. So there's this portlet application that talks to the application server. Well, let's put this in scale. So the application server, and it was talking to EJB2, and inside the EJBs they had all of Spring and Hibernate, because they're doing resume-driven development, so they wanted to make sure they could check those things off on their resume. And it was actually talking to an Oracle database, and the Oracle database would get the results and then output them as XML, which they sent over to Cocoon, and Cocoon did XSLT processing on it to produce the little portlet that showed up in the portlet page. And they upgraded some stuff in the application server, and now it stopped working because they did something stupid with a collection somewhere, so it's blowing the stack off of the virtual machine that's running the application server. And we were talking about this, trying to figure out what the problem was. And at one point, one of the developers said, I asked, how many people is this for? And they said, well, it's for 5 users. And I said, 5 users? And they said, yeah, it'll eventually be 7. I said, how much money have you put into this? And they said, well, it's $1.1 million and counting because it's not working. Like $1.1 million for 5 users? And this is the best part. You know what it does? You fill out like 4 pages of stuff, and then it gives you a new billing code. That's it. That's the whole thing. I said, you realize that a bored college student could rewrite this in Ruby on Rails in a weekend and still have time to go out drinking on Saturday night? This kind of stuff just drives me crazy. But you know why they did that, of course? Because that's the corporate standard stack. All applications must be on the corporate standard stack, regardless of the insanity of putting something that small and trivial. Well, it's $1.1 million. They've literally blown away over $1 million just on their corporate standard. But an interesting thing happened because of all this. Developers are not crazy. Sometimes we're temporarily insane, but we're not crazy long term, and we voted with our feet. Because a lot of people looked at that whole EJB and all that stuff, and they said, that is craziness, and they started using Spring and Hibernate instead. And people read this book by Bruce Tate and Justin Gatlin, Better, Faster, Lighter Java, which was really saying the emperor has no clothes. It's crazy. There are 3 applications on earth that need that entire stack. Most of them don't. And so, you know what always happens? Superheroes always create their own villains. And that's exactly what Sun did in their desire to become a kind of monopolized company of software development, ended up creating their own arch nemesis, and they started the seeds of a revolution called open source. That's number 5 of the threads that I'm pulling together. What they did was legitimize open source for the enterprise. Because before Spring and Hibernate, it was sometimes hard to get big enterprises to accept open source software. Because it's this that you can just download and use that seems wacky, but because the alternative was so crazy, it's like, okay, we'll try anything other than that. That happened, and you also had the Agile software movement. These guys got together in 2001 in Snowbird, Utah, and decided that, you know what, instead of trying to make software development be the way that people want it to be, let's look at the way it works best and then retrofit the way that we build software based on the way that it works best. Act 2 is software ubiquity. In other words, software everywhere. Companies have 2 different attitudes about software. Or there are 2 attitudes that companies have. It's probably a better way of saying it. Some companies view software as purely overhead, just like the plumbing in the building. It's something that we've got to have. If we didn't have to have it, we probably wouldn't, because it's kind of a pain in the ass, but we've got to have it, so it's just overhead. But other companies view software as a strategic advantage. And especially companies that their primary business is dealing with information. Software as a strategic advantage is a really big deal because they can actually make more money if they use software correctly. So you look at a lot of companies that have started investing in this. Look at social networking and LinkedIn. Look at Jonathan Schwartz, the guy who is now running Sun. He has his own blog now. You know, this big corporate guy that has a blog and understands all this stuff that's going around Web 2.0 and all that other stuff, all the things that are happening. In the meantime, you have a lot of people investing a lot of time and effort in enterprise software, with the double quotes on it. Which brings me around to my favorite example of accidental complexity, King Gustav II Adolf and the good ship Vasa. This is 1625 in Sweden, and the king decided he wanted to build 4 warships, and these were going to be the greatest warships ever built, and the flagship was going to be the Vasa. These are actual pictures of the Vasa ship. So he had a special forest felled to make these ships. Most ships at that time had 1 gun deck. He wanted 2 gun decks on this one. He wanted carvings and gold plating and all this gilding on this ship. He wanted the biggest sails that you could get on a ship. So he hired the best shipbuilders in the world to put this ship together. But because he was building this ship, he started picking a fight with all of his neighbors. And of course, what that yielded was schedule pressure, because they started saying, well, you know, you need to come down here and tell us what to do if you're going to say that. And so he started putting schedule pressure on the shipbuilders. Sound like anything you've ever heard of before? And so he put more schedule pressure on them, so they didn't have the chance to do some of the normal kind of safety stuff they do. They didn't really have engineering then. They did this thing called, they didn't really have drawings, they had reckonings, and so they had to... They didn't have time to actually do the lurch test, is what they called it, where you get a bunch of guys on one side of the ship and run to the other side to make sure it doesn't tip over if it's too top heavy or whatever. And so it kept building and kept building. The tension kept building, and they kept building the ship. And so finally the time came. He said, all right, you've had it. I'm going to sail my gunship down there and kill you. And so they launched the Vasa out into the Baltic Sea, and it sank to the bottom. The pictures you were seeing are the actual Vasa ship, because it turns out that ice-cold seawater is a really good preservative for overly complicated warships. And they got it in the early 1900s, salvaged it, and you can go see it. There's a special museum dedicated to it in Sweden. So you ask yourself, how much of enterprise development really does nothing but service accidental complexity? And this is something I alluded to before. You think you have 5 applications that share one database, but you don't. You have one giant application that has 5 heads on it. Because below a certain point, they are highly coupled to one another, and you're terrified of making changes to this thing because it'll break something else. And that's not good. So how did we get to that place? Ivory tower architects, cheap developers, frozen cavemen in CYA, because frozen cavemen are the ones who say, well, the data's got to live forever. So that's our most important criteria, is the database schema that can never change no matter what. Servicing ceremony. And the places that's really playing out in the enterprise development world right now is SOA and enterprise service buses. Anybody with a sense of history and software will tell you that this is the wrong path to a deep, dark place. It is not going to end well. So let's talk about Act 3, which I'm calling the new efficacy. And efficacy is one of those strange little English words that almost nobody in English-speaking countries know. But it means the ability to produce a desired or intended result. I should start by saying that not all ceremony is bad. There is